Hello and welcome everybody to a joint production of Network 2020 and the Institute of Current World Affairs. We are very pleased to have some terrific panelists with us today to discuss the Sahel. Before we begin, I'd just like to give a few words about Network 2020. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we are an inclusive international community, and we're really focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and the foreign policy community. We do a lot of different programs, including webinars like these, but we also do research. We run a deep dive program on China. We do a lot of different activities, so please do check us out at network2020.org for more information, or you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and the other social media as well. I would also like to turn this over to my colleague, Greg Pfeiffer at the Institute of Current World Affairs, just for a little bit of information about what they do.
Thank you very much, Courtney. We're delighted to partner with Network 2020 again. So just a few words about the Institute of Current World Affairs. We send outstanding young professionals abroad on 2-year cultural immersion fellowships. During that time, they research, reflect, and report about globally pressing issues in countries and regions around the world. And they go on to become some of this country's leading experts on global cultures and affairs. Among them is one of our speakers today, Hannah Armstrong, who spent her time as a fellow in West Africa, traveling between Niger, Mali, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, and Algeria in 2012 to 2014. I'm very much looking forward to hear what she and her co-panelists will say today about the Sahel when climate change is increasingly exacerbating conflict there. Thank you very much, and back to you, Courtney.
Thanks so much, Greg. Yeah, I love the Institute of Current World Affairs and all the work that it does, and its real emphasis on the ground learning. It's really a fantastic program. So right now it's my honor to introduce our panelists. First, we have Dr. Leonardo Villalón. He is the Dean of the International Center, an Associate Provost and Professor of Political Science and African Studies at the University of Florida, and he also coordinates the Sahel Research Group there. We also have, next up, Dr. Ibrahim Yahaya Ibrahim, apologies. He is a senior analyst with the International Crisis Group, and he studied actually with Professor Villalón in Florida. And lastly, we have Hannah Armstrong. She is a writer and a consultant, as Greg pointed out, with years of experience of field-based research and working on conflict and crisis in the Sahel and Maghreb. So welcome to the three of you. Thank you so much for being here today. And thank you to our moderator, Joanna Waszewski. She is a nonprofit management consultant and has experience in both domestic and international affairs, and is an integral part of Network 2020's program team. And we're so glad to have her here today. So thank you all for joining us. I will turn it over to you right now, Joanna.
Thank you, Courtney, so much. The Sahel region of Africa, the swath of land below the Sahara Desert, has drawn increasing international attention over the past decade. The countries that make up the Sahel face a number of serious challenges, including lack of government legitimacy, underdevelopment, radical jihadist movements, migration, and the impact of climate change. In recent years, developments such as the killing of 4 US servicemen in Niger and the continued Islamic insurgency in northern Mali have garnered greater attention from the United States and France, who hope to prevent the spread of conflict to other parts of Africa and beyond. Some countries, such as Russia, China, and Turkey, have viewed these developments, on the other hand, as potential opportunities for influence. So what can be done to successfully address the various challenges and concerns of the Sahel region? I look forward to discussing some ideas and strategies with our panelists this afternoon. So if I might begin with you, Leo, could you please provide a very brief historic background on the Sahel region, which countries it consists of, and its importance regionally and potentially globally?
Sure. Thank you so much, John, and thank you, first of all, for having invited me to participate in this discussion, and thanks for having included Hannah and Ibrahim, with whom I always learn a lot, so I really appreciate this opportunity. So Sahel, which just comes from the word of shore or coast in Arabic, meaning the shore, the edge of the desert of the Sahara Desert. It's frequently a geographic term, and sometimes you see maps across Africa with rainfall patterns. But I think what we're going to talk about today, and what the term is generally used today, to refer to the set of countries south of Sahara, from the former Francophone colonies. It's usually 6 countries: Senegal and Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad. So from Sudan to the west along that coast. Senegal is sometimes included and sometimes not, but I think in most cases, sometimes other countries are included in there as well. But in the current political discourse, it's really that set of 6 countries that come to mind when people talk about the Sahel today. A very brief sort of historic background, I think you asked for. So all of these were former French colonies. They all got their independence in 1960, and they all have remained closely tied to France. And France, as we'll, I'm sure, talk about later, remains a very important actor in the region as a result. For the first 3 decades or so of independence, France was the primary outside actor, I think, interested in the area. And they were mostly fairly remote places, if you will, from the perspective of US foreign policy and US interests, mostly military regimes with the exception of Senegal. In the early 1990s, like the rest of the world and certainly of Africa, there were a lot of pro-democracy movements, and all of those countries had elections in the first year or 2 of the 1990s, including Senegal, that actually made real fundamental changes. And then since then, there's been a whole set of sort of back and forth and lots of very disparate outcomes in terms of progress towards democracy, but that still remained very central. But today, when we're talking about the Sahel, and no doubt the reason you've invited us here today is because we frequently talk about the crisis in the Sahel. And this dates back a decade now. The spark, their origins were a bit earlier, but the spark was the collapse of Libya, the fall of Gaddafi, and the subsequent movements in the north of Mali and Niger, and the collapse of Mali and the regime in Mali in 2012, just exactly a decade ago in the next couple of months. And so since then, the region's been, and if you look at the headlines, it's always the Sahelian crisis or a region in crisis or something of the sort. I'm sure the others have stuff to add, but you asked about the importance of it, and I think, if you think of importance for the West, I think France and the US and some other parts think of the importance primarily through the prism of security and international terrorist concerns, but also trafficking, drug smuggling, and especially for the Europeans, immigration. They're worried about people coming to Europe. But that's one sense of importance. I think we'll talk later about some of the new actors in the region who may see other important strategic reasons for intervening, some of the new actors. Of course, the importance for the people there of the situation is that it's their life and well-being and health and livelihoods that are at stake. And so I think that's a much more pressing concern, is the sort of well-being of the people of the region. There's lots more we could talk about it, but I think we'll eventually talk a bit about the specific challenges about the economic and other challenges of the region. But maybe that helps to sort of give you just a very brief overview of what we're talking about, this particular region, those 6 countries.
Great. Oh, thank you so much. Yes, so actually to follow on to what you had just mentioned about some of the political and economic challenges, and this question will be for Hannah and for you, Leo, but I'll start with Hannah first. What are some of those political and economic challenges in the region, and which countries in particular are the most vulnerable?
Thanks. Thank you, Joanna, and hi, everybody. I guess I would start by sort of shining the focus on Mali, which certainly is getting the most headlines at the moment and is in the throes of a very multi-layered crisis. In terms of the economic and political challenges, what we really see is a sort of, to sort of unpack some of the layers of that conflict. What we're seeing at the moment is after there were 2 coups d'etat within an 18-month period, there is a sort of conflict, heavy tensions going on between the transitional authorities and the West African regional bloc, which is supported by France. At the same time, there is an ongoing conflict between northern rebels and the state, who are nominally involved in a peace deal, but unable to make much progress given what's going on. There is another layer of conflict that is going on between jihadists and civilians. In areas like central Mali in particular, jihadists are making very strong inroads in terms of administration and gaining closer relationships with certain communities and really embedding themselves in rural areas and preying on historical rural grievances. There are also another layer of conflict between certain ethnicities, and there is another layer of conflict between drug traffickers. So this is just to kind of give you a sense of the complexity of the conflict dynamics in Mali alone. To sort of shift gears now, I would say in terms of the challenges that we're seeing now, I guess I would draw attention to two in particular that are sort of new challenges. And one is that Mali is in the process of diversifying its foreign partnerships. I think Leo sort of touched on this. I had an internet issue, so I just kind of dipped out and dipped back in on what hopefully is a stronger connection now. But there is a lot of instability at the moment that's linked to sort of renegotiation of Mali's close partnerships. And that renegotiation, the trend of that renegotiation is away from France and Europe and towards Russia and towards new partners and new alliances. Relatedly, the other challenge that I would cite in this context is a rise in disinformation campaigns. So we're seeing with the spread of social media and new technologies into all parts of the countries and new forms of connectedness and communication, especially in Mali, we're seeing a very strong rise in fake news and disinformation campaigns, which are easily politicized and in some cases, linked to conflict. And interestingly, Facebook looked into some of these disinformation campaigns and traced them back not only to Russia, but also to France. Just to kind of maybe say one more thing about, in terms of the three countries of the Central Sahel, the most vulnerable country, and we've looked a little bit at why, is Mali. But we are also seeing in Burkina Faso various stages of jihadist insurgency and near state collapse, sort of on the brink of it's been on the brink of a coup for almost 2 years now. And the more stable of the three countries is Niger, which has just celebrated its first democratic transition since independence, and is making solid progress on a number of fronts, although it is dealing with strong crises on multiple borders. But inside the country, it's managing to sort of hold strong and move forward with state institutions.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. And Leo, what would you like to add to that discussion?
I would agree fully with everything Hannah listed and Hannah mentioned. There's obviously a long list of challenges facing the region. I think I like to sort of with a bit of a historical perspective. I think that the sort of underlying challenge for these, I like to think of the security situation as rather parasitic on some political failings, and the underlying long-term challenge is to build some kind of functional state institutions. Maybe we can talk about that later a little bit, but what we've seen is a gradual, for me, the crisis in Mali, the collapse of Mali in 2012 was a couple of decades in the making, and it was even longer perhaps, of sort of undermining of the capacity of functional state institutions in various ways. And so the challenge is how to rebuild it. And in Mali, it's very hard to see how, as for the reasons Hannah points out, the kinds of conflict and the political dynamics at the moment in the last few weeks are really quite stunning, as you see popular mobilization in favor of the school leaders and against ECOWAS and French efforts to push along a return to a democratic transition, etc. So the political dynamics in Mali are extremely difficult to see. But Hannah's final point about Niger, for example, seeming to do a bit better is, I think, because in a sense, Niger has been more effective at building some kinds of functional state institutions. They're still fragile and there's still points of vulnerability, but I think that the big challenge is that I would identify politically in the region is to try to rebuild state capacity. Now the problem is how do you do that in conditions of extreme insecurity? You need the security, so you have to have the military, but then that might undermine the institution building. And so you're in a constant dilemma there. I don't know what the solution is, but I see that as the big challenge to find a way forward.
All right, thank you so much. Well, the next question will be for Ibrahim and for Hannah, but I'll start with you, Ibrahim. You know, as been mentioned, that the great focus has been on terrorism and Islamic insurgencies in the Sahel. Could you please explain some of the sources of this conflict and what role do various Islamic political movements play?
Ibrahim, you're muted.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rowan, and thanks everybody. So yes, I think one of the major challenges that's facing the Sahel region is the rise of the jihadist insurgency throughout the region. And this one, the jihadist insurgency first started as a spillover of the Algerian other jihadist insurgency. And the earlier presence of the jihadist group goes back to the early 2000s. Since then, the jihadist groups, in particular the group of Salafism and the Salafi group for predication and combat established sanctuaries in northern Mali. They recruited several combatants from the local communities. That continued until, as Leo mentioned, the fall of Gaddafi in Libya, but also other local transformations that created a fertile ground for the insurgency to start in 2012. And since then, we had at that time in 2012, we had a number of jihadist groups that coalesced together with several local separatist rebel armed groups to conquer northern Mali, Burkina Faso, northern Mali, Timbuktu, Kidal, and Gao. And from there, we had an intervention in 2013 by the French, by a French led military operation that ousted the jihadists from the major towns, but they dispersed it in rural areas from where they organized the insurgency, in particular in the rural areas. Since then, we have seen the jihadist insurgency that has expanded, but also violence that intensified. So from the northern Mali, where it started, the insurgency moved to central Mali, and then to the border between Niger and Mali, and then to Burkina Faso. Today, and then to Niger too. And today we are talking about the spillover of the insurgency in the countries of Gulf of Guinea, in particular in northern Cote d'Ivoire, northern Benin, northern Togo, and northern Ghana, where the insurgency is also spreading slowly. There are two groups, or two main groups that are responsible of this insurgency. The first one is Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam al-Muslimin, which is a coalition of several jihadist groups in the region that are linked to Al-Qaida General Command, or they pledge allegiance to Al-Qaida movement. And the other group is the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, which is linked to ISIS. Now, in addition to the jihadist violence, the overall insurgency has also produced other major destabilizing effects. And the first one is intercommunal violence. Communities, as jihadist violence proliferated, several communities organized themselves to protect their properties and their communities. And those militias, the proliferation of those militias has created or led to the outbreak of a very deadly intercommunal violence. This intercommunal violence has been deadlier and more damaging than the jihadist insurgency itself. The other destabilizing effect is also the instability, the political instability that we see in urban centers. So the jihadists have not been able to conquer major urban cities. The insurgency has been mostly rural, but the violence that they have created in the rural areas is producing reactions in the urban centers that destabilize the center of political power. So we have seen several protests that led to the ousting of Ibrahim Keita in Mali, and then we see similar protests that are increasing in Burkina Faso, but also in Niger. But this has been really seriously destabilizing for the government in the region. I don't know if I have more time, but I could talk about how the authorities have reacted to it, and how that has been really, what are the shortcomings, or how that has been limited in terms of reducing or addressing the challenge of insecurity.
Yeah, actually, that was my next question: is what have they done to address the local authorities, country authorities? What have they done to try to address these challenges? Have there been any positive developments in that direction?
So the major government in the area, but also their partners, in particular, France is a major partner in this region, and also the European Union. They have together been struggling to contain the jihadist insurgency, but most of the response has been military-based. So we have had several military operations by the national armies of the countries in the region, by the UN peacekeeping mission, by the French Barkhane operation, but also a local, what is called a joint force of the G5 Sahel, and now we have a European mission that is called Takuba, that are all trying to provide a military response to the rising security crisis. But we see that despite all these efforts, the insurgency has only been getting stronger and expanding larger and intensifying in terms of violence. So this underlines the shortcoming of a military solution by the state. Others have tried to promote a development solution, thinking that this is all related to poverty, and then we need to address poverty in order to address the insurgency. The problem is that it has been incredibly difficult to perform development activities in areas that are controlled by the jihadist groups. And even when they get to do it, at the end, those who get the benefit of it are the jihadists, who claim to be the one who facilitated those development activities. So it has not been really successful, neither the development nor the military solution. We have been advocating at Crisis Group for a political solution, which it would entail also engaging those groups that are responsible for the violence, engaging them in dialogue, so that we can try to produce a political settlement of the conflict rather than the military one.
All right, well, thank you very much. And then Hannah, I know we briefly spoke about the terrorism aspect, insurgency in Mali. I don't know if you would like to add more about Mali and other countries. In addition, I know that you've written on women and peace efforts in Mali. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on those issues?
Sure, thanks. Thank you, Joanna. Yeah, I mean, I would say that, one positive development that it tends to get sort of overshadowed by the maelstrom of terrible things happening in Mali in particular, has been the integration of women into the highest levels of the Malian peace process. So even as the peace process gets sort of sidelined by what seem to be more pressing issues, a large contingent of women have been integrated into its highest instances, which is really interesting in a few ways. To begin, it sort of builds on a domestic trend of women sort of showing up at negotiations that they were not invited to for the past couple of decades, and just kind of demanding to be let in, and saying we have our words that we're going to say, and you can try to keep your meetings between men, but we're here in Algiers, we're here in Burkina Faso, and we're going to force our way into these meetings. We're going to speak. So this is a trend that we've seen in previous rebellions within Mali. At the same time, in the past 5 years or so, there's been mounting international pressure on Mali to try to make the peace process more inclusive, especially by integrating women into it in a more formal capacity. So thanks to these sort of domestic trends of women pushing their way in and international trends of sort of pressuring the Malian authorities and rebel groups to, not keep having these meetings where you maybe have one woman at best. We've had a significant, in the past 2 years, there's been a significant integration of women, particularly into the monitoring committee of the Malian peace process, of the Malian peace agreement, which is overseen by Algeria. So, this is an imperfect integration. Some people say that it's that northern women are overrepresented and southern women are underrepresented. Some people say that these women are not don't have the civil society credentials that they would like them to have, or are benefiting from family relationships and things like that. But having spent a lot of time over the past year, kind of in deep talks with many of these women, I would say that they really confidently that they really bring a lot to the table. And in terms of sort of widening the implications of the peace deal and ensuring that not only armed men are represented in these talks, but communities, including women, including children, including rural groups, including civil society. Increasingly, women are sort of a vehicle for hearing more and different and more diverse types of voices in these discussions. So I would count that as a very positive development.
Great, thank you so much. So then, if I can turn to the outside powers involvement about the role of France, role of Russia, China, and the United States. So if I could ask you, Leo, if you could just briefly talk about what the current involvement is of the various countries, and also later, Hannah, if you could talk about Turkish interests in the region. So I'll start with you, Leo, please.
Well, I'll make a few comments. I'm sure both Ibrahim and Hannah can jump in, and they have the following events. This is all rapidly developing, I think, outside influence. So, as I mentioned, of course, historically, this was France's stomping grounds. This is France's précaré, the area of French influence. But the U.S. has gotten increasingly interested, primarily through the prism of anti-terrorism, and we can talk about that perhaps a little bit more later about U.S. strategy. But in recent years, we have seen this proliferation of new actors with interest in the area. So you mentioned Turkey, and I think you just asked Hannah, maybe she can comment on it more, but I would just say that Turkey, of course, is trying to position itself as a major new international actor on a global scale. And I don't remember the numbers right offhand, but it's something in the range of, you went from 10 or a dozen Turkish embassies on the continent 10 or 15 years ago to 45 of them now, right? Embassies. So, I mean, Turkey has made a huge push across Africa, not just in the Sahel. So it's part of a broader Turkish strategy for sort of a new great power, new kinds of powers at the international level. But the one that everybody's talking about now, and Ibrahim and Hannah may be able to comment more, of course, is a Russian presence. And the Russian presence specifically, again, it's part of a broader Russian strategy as far as I understand it, and it's more elsewhere in Africa as well. The Russians are very involved in Central African Republic some years ago, and controversially. But in Mali at the moment, there's a huge political debate about Russian influence, and specifically about the presence of Russian military advisors or groups or private security firms, whatever, especially this Wagner group that I don't know a lot about, but it's much discussed. Maybe my colleagues do. And sort of the role of the Russians in Mali as a possible alternative. They're being used clearly by the Malian regime to sort of put pressure on France and to balance France. The French are very unhappy about this, as are the Americans. So I think those are the two. And then, of course, the other major power in the area that's been heavily involved in other ways have been the Chinese. And that's, of course, predates the crisis in the Sahel, and it's part of, again, a much broader Chinese initiative. But across the region as well, we see a lot of Chinese investment and a lot of Chinese influence in all sorts of domains. So this has really diversified the landscape. 10 years ago, we would, if you thought about international actors attempting to weigh in on developments in the Sahel, it was a France with US on the side once in a while, and a little bit of aid and other things there. And this is a completely different terrain, is my sense. And again, Hannah or Ibrahim may have stuff to add to that.
Thank you. Yes, so Hannah?
Thanks. Yeah, no, I mean, I absolutely agree with what Leo has said. I would start any discussion of this diversification of foreign partnerships by really sort of emphasizing the rise in anti-French sentiment, which is very linked to the failure of the French strategy for stabilizing the Sahel. You know, which has coincided with not only not a sort of stabilization or move towards security, but with a very steep precipitous drop into much further and worse types of insecurity across borders in a growing number of countries in the region. That's not to say that France is to blame for all of that, but having taken as vocal and as much of a leadership role as France did, it's very easy for people in Mali in particular to sort of lay the blame on France. So we're seeing that happen. And we're also seeing, you know, alongside that, I don't know if anyone has mentioned that in this talk, but, you know, the French counterterror operation Barkhane drawing down its numbers. We're seeing a transition from the sort of French-led security initiative with American support to one that is apparently more Europeanized, more internationalized. This is what France would like to sort of pass it off as. It's not terribly convincing. At any rate, this is sort of the context for new actors like Russia and Turkey to come in. Russia, you know, a few things I would say about Russia. It's not a new actor in the Sahel. It was very close to Mali early on after independence, and it has been Mali's lead arms supplier for years. So there are existing close ties between Mali, the Mali military, and Russia already. And although there's been a great deal of speculation and concern, we don't actually know what the nature of the current dealings are between the Malian transitional authorities and the Russians. The Malians tend to say that they're dealing with Russian military trainers and not with mercenaries, and you know, there's a lot of talk and not a lot of evidence on it. So I think we really kind of need some more time to see how that's going to work out. To just briefly touch on Turkey, I did publish a piece over the summer looking at Turkey in the Sahel, which was really interesting to work on. There was a lot of disinformation going around about what Turkey was up to. You know, it was a bit paranoid, and what was really alarming to me in all of that kind of gossip was that, you know, it was sort of inviting an eruption of the Gulf spat in the Sahel. And we've already seen tensions between Gulf countries sort of add a new layer of conflict in areas like Libya and Somalia. And, you know, given the many layers of conflict that already exist in the Sahel, the last thing we need is for, you know, the UAE and Saudi Arabia to be going up against Qatar and Turkey in the Sahel. But what I found when I started to sort of look into it was that Turkey was really leading with a very soft power focused approach in the Sahel. You know, and it really wasn't in getting involved in fighting. It wasn't getting involved in conflict zones. It had in a couple of cases, it could be seen to be paving the way. It's too early to say. But the types of rumors and stories that were circulating were completely unfounded. And what Turkey was really doing was, you know, building schools, building hospitals, and building mosques. And, you know, creating new opportunities for trade with Africans, you know, Sahelians who were having a harder and harder time getting into Europe, you know, for economic trade opportunities. So it was a really interesting approach. You know, it was interesting to note how the Sahel was really sort of welcoming the way that Turkey was approaching it, which wasn't, you know, a question of sending troops, but was rather a question of building schools, again, building really top-notch health clinics, infrastructure, airports, roads, things that the Sahelian countries really need and have been asking for. So, you know, that's an interesting example. That's not to say that there might not be deals to sell drones or dispatch counter-terror trainers down the road. But so far, in terms of what's actually materialized, it's very much around soft power. And that's consistent with Turkey's foreign policy in Africa, which is, you know, very much about kind of building commercial trade and export networks. So just to kind of close on this subject, I would just say, you know, one thing I think it's really important to keep in mind is that what we really need to avoid, I don't know who we is in that sentence, but it really needs to be avoided, you know, these new types of great power rivalry or, you know, GCC competition. The last thing the Sahel needs is new layers of fighting between countries that don't really concern it. So I think it's really sort of important to be very vigilant about what's happening and to really kind of avoid those types of conflicts adding themselves to the already incredibly complicated conflicts that exist.
Yes, thank you. It's obviously very complicated. I will ask this last question before I look at our participants' questions, but it'll be for Ibrahim. What are some other challenges facing the Sahel region? And I'm thinking specifically of the coronavirus, migration from neighboring countries, climate change, particularly. Could you make some comments regarding those issues? Oh, you're muted.
Just very quickly, the COVID, when we talk about the major challenges facing the Sahel, COVID is not one of them right now. And just because the numbers that we see of infection are not great. But let me say clearly, one of the reasons why the numbers are so low is also because there is, there is few testing. But also the lethality of the virus has not been as great as it has been in other places in the world, like in the United States or in Europe. There have been several explanations that were put forward, including the nature of the demography, which you have a lot of youth in Africa, young population as compared to the older population, or the fact that people have been have been faced with so many diseases in the past. Perhaps they have had quite a bit that have produced anticorps that may be significantly reducing the risk of having the coronavirus. But in any ways, the coronavirus, the crisis of the coronavirus hit the Sahelian countries much less than it is a factor in other places. Now the governments have been mimicking the other countries around the world in terms of imposing drastic measures to try to curtail it. And those measures that they put forward have produced a lot of angers in the past. In particular, last year, when we saw several protests across the region, people, denouncing the curfews or the closing of borders or the closing of, religious worship places, etc. But this has not been the case, in particular this year. So the corona disease and also the government response to it this year has not been much of a controversy as it has been previously. Now, the second aspect, I think, it's climate change, which is a reality. I think it is hitting the Sahelian region in a very difficult way. We have seen several floods across the region that has destroyed crops, etc. But also we have seen droughts. So there is an alternation of either more rains that come at the same time that produce damages, or droughts with less rain and the crops not being produced. And this has been really damaging in the last few years. There is a tendency to establish a linkage between the climate change crisis in the Sahel and the rise of conflicts. And we have been really pushing back on this particular relationship between conflict and the climate change, saying that if there is, it's true that climate change is producing damages, but it's mostly producing competition, more competition over resources. And that competition is being wrongly managed or not managed at all, not regulated by the states. And the inability of the state to regulate the competition that arises from this disaster is what is producing conflict rather than the climate change itself producing conflict. The government likes to explain the conflict and the rise of conflict in the area with natural disaster that they do not have control over. It is very easy for them to say that, to blame the mother nature of what is going on. But we are keen to bring back the government to the responsibility and saying that nature is not what to blame. It is the way that you manage what arises from these natural disasters that is to blame. I think I'll stop there. Time is going.
Great, thank you so much.
Can I make a quick comment
Oh
on
yes,
climate
please.
change? It's not my area of expertise at all, but I agree very, very much with Ibrahim. And I think it's very important to push back on this sort of climate change leads directly to competition leads to conflict, and that's where the conflict is coming from, because it is a question of institutions, as Ibrahim said. But the other point I would make that I'd make is that this is a long discourse in the region. And from the 60s and 70s, there were all sorts of discussions about the Sahara spreading south, the expansion of the Sahara, the whole region. This has been a very long thing, and it's been managed in a variety of ways. And there are also resources for managing this in the region that are local. Mobility and adaptability defines the Sahel. That's what it's always done. People move and people adapt. And so in the right environment, of course, conflict makes it much more difficult to both move and to adapt. So it's a political issue, but there are resources to move and to adapt. And there are people working on things like sort of locally initiated regreening initiatives of farmer-led tree planting to sort of control areas that have been remarkably successful. And in Niger in particular, there have been some really successful spots, and those tend not to make the news. So my point is that there's sometimes very easy to sort of see the Sahel as a question of just despair. These incredibly poor countries are now going to be subject to climate change. It's all disaster. And I think we need to look at the fact that under the right conditions, and that's of course important, the right political conditions, there are local initiatives, local resources, and local capacity for adapting and managing these issues. They're a challenge for everybody.
Great, thank you so much. And actually, here's a question from one of the members of the audience, and I think I'll ask you, Leo, to please address it. Is what are the medium to longer term development prospects for the Sahel region? What are its comparative advantages other than a limited number of commodities?
So, you know, that's a huge question. It's a very important one. I'm not sure I can do justice to it, but the Sahelian countries are among the least developed on earth by most of the statistics and standards. If you look, we didn't mention this at the beginning, at the UNDP's Human Development Index, they're clustered. The landlocked ones, the 4 landlocked ones, are clustered in the bottom 5 or 6 countries of the world. And Senegal and Mauritania have a coastline and fisheries and are a little better off, but they're still towards the bottom. If we're talking about development, like attempting to achieve middle income standards of living for the majority of the population, not to meet question standards, they're not good. If that's what you want, as particularly within the bigger the existing international context. But maybe that's the wrong sort of yardstick, right? I mean, we can think about alternatives. If you look at a place like Senegal, where I think, and to varying degrees, Niger and others have managed it. If you can get the right institutions and political stability, it is possible to develop capacities for educating children, for providing health services, for providing livelihoods and employment in all sorts of ways and challenges. And those, I think the prospects are that we have to assume they're reasonable and that we have to work towards that. What's the alternative? And the question is creating the right environments, and those have to be international as well. And the focus on the militarization and security situation in the area, rather than on building capable state institutions towards achieve those, is we're heading in the wrong direction. I think that's pretty clear. At least it's my sense. So that's not a very satisfactory answer, but that's the best I can do. I think I refuse to give in to despair. The Sahel has been subject of a lot of despair, and yet it would be silly to deny the very real challenges. The progress has been made, remarkable progress in terms of education and child mortality and things like that in the right places with the institutions, given the existing resources. I don't know, Ibrahim, or perhaps you should chime in on that one, I think, or Hannah. But
anyone want to add anything? No? Okay. I guess what would be the right balance between development, developmental aid and military assistance? We seem to be seeing a lot of military assistance, but is there a finer balance? Is it in any, what should be the priority ultimately? So why don't I can pose that question to you, Ibrahim.
Well, thank you very much. I do think that in line with what Leo just said about the need to really invest more in producing stronger institutions, in improving the governance in the area. This is where I think more effort should be put at. Of course, we need military to be functional and to be able to protect the populations and to defend the country's border, etc. But this has been really been the focus of the international community from the beginning of this crisis. It's to invest more in terms of security, and investing in security also has some downsides, which is you enhance in countries that have fragile democracies. You have two main constituencies that constitute that fight for power. You have the politicians, the group of political leaders, the Democrats, they are called sometimes, and then the military. In countries like Niger, over the 90s, we have seen a struggle, a rivalry between those two different constituencies. And starting from the 2000s, I think the political elite, the politicians got to prevail in that struggle. Today, and this is not only in Niger, all the money that is being pumped in the military, they have been brought back at the center of attention. Everybody is looking at them to save countries that are in great disarray, and this is bringing them back. This is reinforcing the military's position as opposed to the politicians or to the political class in the countries, and this is very dangerous. And we see more appetite from the military officers, to take over power in the region, and I think this is somehow related to the fact that this crisis in some ways is beneficial in general, to the military institutions in this rivalry between it and the political class. So I do think, and what we need really in order to stabilize the countries in the longer term is, I totally agree with Leo, is building stronger and better institutions, political institutions, improving governance, etc. Political aid is important too, because there are people who do need this aid, but in terms of producing solution to the crisis, I do think that this should be subjugated to the political solution that we have been mentioning from the beginning of this conflict. Not it to be prioritized, but I think to be subjugated. We improve politics. We try to find a political solution and then back it up with development aid and even the military.
Great, thank you so much. And then there's a question for Hannah. What role can civil society organizations, especially those of women, to help peace building in Mali and other countries in the Sahel?
Thanks. I mean, civil society organizations have played a very important role and will continue to play a very important role. They have been involved in asking for rights and shedding light on certain situations. In some cases, we see, this in the case of Niger, for instance, we're seeing sort of more of a crackdown on, activists, civil society activists and journalists who are speaking out, which is sort of surprising in the larger context of what's happening in Niger. But, in certain areas in Mali, we're seeing civil society organizations that are founded by women and led by women that are working really hard to sort of play a role in peace building initiatives. So the women, tend to be sort of, as I mentioned earlier, sort of closer to the communities in some ways than the armed men. who are often sort of rent seeking and worried about things like DDR and how are they going to manage these fighters that they've been sustaining and convert them into sort of peacetime people with some sort of employment that might tempt them to lay down their arms. That's its own whole struggle. But the women, are sort of in a different political space where their concerns more broadly align with the concerns of communities. So in places like Menaka in central eastern Mali, we've really seen women playing a strong role in trying to build awareness about intercommunal tensions and trying to kind of push back against some of the causes for fighting, and trying to push back against some of the recruitment networks for violent extremists, et cetera. So I think there's definitely a strong role for these organizations and the messages that they carry.
Great.
Jump in on that just a second, because I would, of course, agree with Hannah. Civil society organizations are important everywhere in the world, but I just a little bit of I think you have to resist the temptation to be enamored to think that civil society organizations are the solution as an alternative to government institutions. And I think one of the pitfalls of the democratization assistance of sorts that happened in the 1990s, for example, in Mali, was that the state was marginalized. And we thought, well, we can solve the problems by focusing on NGOs and civil society organizations. And rather than work with the Ministry of Information and to get a good media law and to promote, we promoted civil society groups, et cetera, who are in opposition to the government. And those groups are trying to survive. They're trying to find their own, they're finding resources from the international system, et cetera. That doesn't create infrastructure. And so I think I would agree that civil society organizations are important, but it shouldn't be as an alternative to focusing on governments. We need to focus on building state institutions. We need a Ministry of Health and a Ministry of Education and a Ministry of media and communications and justice, et cetera, that are functional and have capable and well-trained individuals, and they exist, and they need to be brought into those ministries rather than only existing in this space where they're competing with each other for direct resources from the outside world. So,
Great, thank you. And actually, I will ask this of you, Leo. The position of U.S. Special Envoy for the Sahel region was established in 2020, and I would ask you, what advice would you share with the Special Envoy? What would be the priorities that you would recommend to him or her?
Yeah, well, let me see if I can try to answer that. I think that position was created. I think Dr. Peter Pham was the first occupant of that position. I think he's gone, and I don't think it's been replaced. I don't think the Biden administration. Hannah, you're nodding, so I guess you know. I don't believe there's been a new special envoy for the Sahel named. I don't know if that is simply the Biden administration hasn't gotten around to it, or it's less of a priority. Here's what I'd say. It's clearly whatever we've been doing, it hasn't been working. We've increased our involvement in the region primarily in the there was in the 90s and into the 2000s some democracy support through USAID and those kinds of things, but the real involvement in the region in the last decade has been, or even more than a decade, through the military kinds of optic, and specifically this Trans-Saharan Counterterrorism Partnership, as it's known. It's a major US government initiative. It's supposed to be focused on the region. If you look, a little over a year ago, the Office of the Inspector General, I think, did an audit of the Trans-Saharan Counterterrorism Project. And you can find it online, it's readily available, but it says we've been remarkably ineffective at using those resources. Enormous amounts of resources have not gone anywhere, and they've actually gone, if you look at the list, I sort of skimmed through this report, look at it, the ones they audited, they're large US-based consulting firms that are collecting contracts of tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars to promote to counter terrorism in the Sahel, and have been obviously very highly ineffective in doing so. So clearly, I would tell the special envoy, rethink this all, start from scratch, think somewhere else. And there are no easy answers. It would be it'd be facile to sort of just critique and whatever, saying I don't know what the solution is, but because you obviously need a reasonably secure environment in order to do the more foundational and fundamental things that need to be done for a long-term prospect. So you can't say forget about any kind of military presence here. We do have to, deal with that, with the insecurity to try to create that environment. But that shouldn't be the end goal. The end goal's got to be the sort of focus on what are we doing to build institutions and to build capacity. Investing in education, I think, is primary. What the Sahel mostly has, its greatest resource, are young people. Lots of young people. It's an incredibly youthful population, an incredibly vibrantly youthful population with extraordinary creativity and capacity for adapting it. And the countries like Senegal, which is also a poor country in terms of natural resources, that have a very long-term strategy of having invested in human resources, find that Senegalese are populating international agencies and organizations and world banks and public sector and private sector, and they're doing extremely well. And there's a dynamic and creative population of young people in Dakar and in the rest of Senegal. And so I think that's where you have to invest the resources, and that's where it has to, and the security has to be secondary. Create the conditions under which you can invest in where there is hope. But yeah, I think if there's a resource for the Sahel, it's human resources, incredibly creative. And I would add, the Europeans are having a huge problem. They don't have enough young people. And so whether they like it or not, the Sahelians are coming and others are coming. And if done right, this could be a tremendous boon and resource for the rest of the world. The out-migration, which is mostly not to Europe, but elsewhere in Africa from the Sahel. But what is going is these are brains, these are human resources. There's, we have it in this country, huge demand for qualified workers. The Sahel can produce them, and we need to invest in that, I would think.
If I could just jump in on the heels of that, which is very lovely, and I know Senegal is going to welcome you warmly and really agree with everything you've said, Leo. I know we only have a few minutes left, and since this is, I think, mainly an American audience, I wanted to sort of pick up on this question about sort of U.S. policy in the region. And as you mentioned, there has not yet been a new U.S. envoy to the Sahel appointed. And I think the first thing that the U.S. should do is go ahead and make that appointment. When you look at the different initiatives from the State Department, Pentagon, USAID in the region, what an envoy could do that would be very useful is to sort of streamline different types of U.S. policy that are acting sometimes without a great deal of coordination with one another. And this could really help the U.S. policy to sort of become more strategic in a meaningful way. And on the heels of that, I would just sort of add that, the policy right now sort of consists of supporting the French strategy, which the EU is sort of also doing. And American policymakers have been relatively straightforward about that. When the French were disappointed that the submarine deal went to the Australians, the Americans sort of said, well, we'll give you X, Y, and Z in the Sahel to sort of, compensate for that. And this is really, this is really a mistake. The French policy has been really sort of discredited and is being renegotiated. And, I think it's a really good time for the US to sort of rethink and renegotiate and streamline its policy stance in the Sahel, where it's spending a great deal of money and where it still has a very strong reputation. So there's a lot of potential to sort of do more and do better.
Great, thank you so much. And just in the couple minutes really we have left, it'll be kind of like a lightning round. I would just be interested in hearing, we've heard so many of the challenges and we've mentioned some of the positive developments. I would like to end on a positive note to say, what do you feel will be the most likely positive outcome in the near future in the Sahel? So if I may start with you, Ibrahim. Oh, you're muted.
Okay, after all what has been said, I do think that perhaps the pressure on the government to start thinking seriously, really about, for example, Leo has mentioned the benefit of educated people. I was delighted, for example, in Niger, that when Bazoum was elected, his major political program, I think the program for the country is education, is investing in education, particularly in girls' education. which is really huge, and they're doing really good work in terms of improving that. So I do see a government trying to learn some of the lessons that came out from this crisis, and to try to do better. I think in terms of their governance, there are still a lot of issues. I think we come from afar, but I do see goodwill from some of these authorities to try to do better job than the previous one, and to be accountable. And I see also communities really, or people in particular in social media, to try to press the government. I see more engagement, more political engagement from youth, from educated people, from different walk of life. People being interested in politics and trying to be involved and to press. So I do see also this as a positive development, despite all the other problems.
Great, thank you, Hannah.
Thanks. I guess I would say, I think the positive development is we're seeing a drawdown of the overly securitized military approach in the region, and that has not provided stability and has created new types of problems and conflict. And for various reasons and from various sources, we're seeing that sort of lift. So I think that we can expect hopefully some positive benefits from that, and from more of an emphasis on political solutions.
Great, thank you. And Leo?
Yeah, I think I would agree very much with what Ibrahim and Hannah have said, so I don't have a lot to add. But I think if I think of a positive trend, it seems to me that we've reached a point when dialogue is more possible in the region than it was some years ago, and there's some opening to kinds of discussions, including political ones. It's easy to be cynical about places like Mauritania or Chad, we haven't talked about much, but both of those are engaged in some pretty interesting discussions between longtime opposition people to talk about big picture issues. How are we going to restructure government, restructure issues, et cetera. And I think the opening of dialogue and discussion among local actors is what we should be investing. It's hard to see it in Mali in some ways, but then again, maybe it's with a caveat. I would say that's an opening that might be positive.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I mean, this has been a fantastic discussion. You've covered an awful lot of territory and a lot of issues. And I hope somebody in governments around the world are listening. So thank you so much. And I turn it over to Courtney.
All right. Thank you, Joanna, for moderating. Leo, Ibrahim, Hannah, thank you all. Fantastic job today. And I'd like to thank the audience too. The questions were really, really phenomenal, and I'm sorry we could not get to all of them. And lastly, thank you to Greg and the Institute of Current World Affairs. It's just great to partner with your fellows and former fellows on talks like these. So thank you, everyone. We are going to be back here tomorrow, actually, for those of you who are interested in something very different. Well, actually, not completely different. Actually, we will be touching on Africa tomorrow, or parts of the continent as well, when we're looking at the BRI, so Beijing's expanding economic orbit. So this is tomorrow at 12 Eastern time. Please do feel free to RSVP or send this to someone who might be interested in joining. So thank you all again for joining us today. Thank you particularly to our panelists, and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Bye, Ibrahim. Bye, Hannah. Bye.
All right.